This is the BBC.
This is InTouch, the magazine programme for people like me who are blind or partially sighted. I'm Peter White. Thanks for downloading this week's edition. Good evening. Are UK streets becoming no-go areas for visually impaired people? For years, InTouch listeners have been claiming that they are. Now we're planning a series of investigations into getting around in 2018 and beyond. We'll also be asking for your help. Now, if we seem to be obsessed with so-called shared spaces, it's because many of you have made it clear over the past 10 years or more that this concept is blighting your lives. The principle is that traffic, bicycles, pedestrians can happily use the same space, and that our streets will be less cluttered and more relaxed if we do. There's more, of course, but I can't do better than allow the blind people of Leeds talking to us back in 2008 to explain why they thought it was a thoroughly bad idea, even back then.
People have a dedicated pathway, that's a pedestrian right-of-way, and you feel safe and secure actually using that. When you talk about shared surfaces, it's basically the loss of that security through the loss of the path from the experiences which I've had and others have had. And it's the dangers that are inherently associated with an individual pedestrian being mixed with road traffic and actually feeling that you're the poor relative when it comes to any confrontation between a vehicle or a pedestrian.
We're asking for a tarmac pavement which has got a different colour, or we're asking for paving stones so that we can distinguish between the shared space area and the pavement.
They do say that the driver should have eye contact with you. They can't have eye contact with me because I've no sight whatsoever. In fact, I'll take my eyes out and wave them at them.
But despite those trenchant views, what began as an experimental trickle of shared space schemes rapidly turned to a flood. Many planners seemed to love the idea. Local authorities claimed they'd consulted widely, and supporters of the schemes pointed out that the predicted dangers hadn't resulted in the predicted accidents. Meanwhile, we've covered demonstrations against them, parliamentary debates, and in Lisburn, in Northern Ireland, a successful judicial review against the town's shared space scheme. But despite the success of that judicial review, is there more to this than a persecuted minority being ignored by the planners? After all, it's not just the UK. These schemes are proving popular in many other parts of Europe and beyond. And alongside such developments are coming electric cars, self-driving cars and alternative public transport schemes, which look like completely changing the scene in the years to come. Well, perhaps we have to adapt the methods we use to get about in order to cope. These are big questions which we want to examine over the next year, and almost by accident we've come across a project with the same agenda. It's based in the city where some of our earliest protesters came from. Anna Lawson is Professor of Law and Director of the Centre for Disability Studies at Leeds University. She's about to start on a 5-year project funded with EU money to investigate how the streets here and in 4 other countries exclude those who don't conform to the typical driver, cyclist or pedestrian. Handy then that she's come across a colleague whose brief is to map the cities of the future and how we will want to operate within them.
I'm Richard Romano. I'm a professor, chair in driving simulation at University of Leeds. So the first step is really to provide a digital representation of the city. So this
Professor Romano uses digital techniques to simulate developments in transport and urban design in modern cities.
Them to say, well, I've always wanted a pedestrian crossing here, or I've always wanted a cycling lane there, and laying out all those things and collecting all that information, and then we can get together as a group and make decisions as to which ones we'd like to evaluate a little more, and then we can implement those both, say, rapidly on the street if there's some things, so we could paint a bike lane down or put some new light touch infrastructure in and test it. Or we could do the same thing in our virtual model and then have people put on a headset. So you see these VR headsets in the news and everything like that, and walk around and experience it and say, oh yeah, that's pretty good, or no, it felt really dangerous to be in that spot. Because we can also bring then in our immersive simulation, have traffic driving down the road and everything else. So you're really interacting like it's a typical day in Bradford.
I've found it fascinating listening to that, actually, because part of the aims of the project are the main aim is to capture the experience of exclusion that disabled people and older people in particular experience when they're using streets. And we're going to be using film and video and storytelling as part of capturing their experience. And then also built in is a link to the type of technology that Rich has developed and been using here in Leeds. And I think some of the ongoing technology that emerges through projects like the one you're describing would be really helpful for my project as well, because it's about looking at the way technology can help to throw light on the experience of people so that can be taken into account by people who are designing cities or imagining cities and what they would look like. Because there's some evidence that in the past, when people experience streets that feel dangerous or difficult to use, they stop going there, and then they stop being counted for purposes of, when surveys are taken, they tend to focus on people who are still using the streets. So the experiences of those who have stopped using them become less relevant and less factored into future design in some ways.
One of the things I think that's pointed out very well there is this whole idea of a downward spiral that you need to stop and we need to get it to go the other way, this whole concept of not being counted. So if people aren't going to the local park and using it because there's something else that's causing them not to go there, and so it's understanding what are the access issues to that.
That's right, and I think sometimes, people think, oh, it's accessible because there aren't curbs or, there's flat curbs. And that's been a particular problem that's come to the fore in relation to blind people in the last couple of years. Something called shared space has been really controversial. Although technically it looks quite accessible because it doesn't have, hard obstacles like curbs. The problem is it's a traffic calming measure initially, that the idea is that drivers and pedestrians share the same space, and that means that drivers go slower and they have different types of interaction with pedestrians. But there's growing evidence that for blind people, but also for lots of other disabled and older people actually, that can be a very problematic type of space to use. That's about policy and the way streets are being designed in a way that looks accessible, but actually it creates new sorts of barrier that drives people away.
In what way? What would be the...
Well, blind people can't tell when a car's coming towards them. You can hear that it's somewhere near, but you can't necessarily tell that the driver's seen you and is going to stop. Guide dogs, it creates problems because guide dogs are used to walking in the middle of a curb. What do they do in a big open space? There's no consistency about the type of tactile marking that's there. So it's very confusing for a blind person to know what the signals actually mean. And then for wheelchair users, they've stated that they're often not able to make the kind of eye contact with drivers that they need to in order to feel safe to cross a road. So people have left university because shared spaces have been introduced between their home and the university buildings. People have moved home because of these things being introduced. And it's a type of design that's being introduced quite rapidly in lots of different areas of the UK and other countries. And there's still limited research on the experiences of older and disabled people in using these things.
But isn't this something time urgent? Like, this shouldn't this be happening now? If
yes.
things are going on, like you're
yes.
a 5-year plan that's sort of...
Yes. Yeah, that's very right. Things are going on now. There is quite a lot of campaigning. One of the other aims of the project is to look at the ways different types of campaign happen and the ways in which solidarity can be developed, and through technologies like the ones Rich has been describing, the way people who experience these types of barrier can develop a sense of shared exclusion and deepen that sense of solidarity with other sectors of the population, rather than it being perceived as a real niche issue that only affects certain pockets of the population and therefore isn't so important, perhaps.
Maybe it would help some of the policymakers to consider the blind perspective if they had, if that was done on simulators where they could visualise the experience of a blind person going down this.
That's exactly the plan. Yeah. So there's a pedestrian simulator that Rich has developed.
Yeah, well, that's the best way to imagine it is it's a glass-walled room. There's projectors on the other side of the wall, projecting onto the glass and making you feel like you're anywhere in the world. And so with that, rather than using a headset, we can create something that with visual and audio cues that feels like you're in the real world. If you look at limited sight or limited hearing, there's a lot of people who have some mixture of both. So we can begin to understand the needs and test all these things, but we can also bring people in and give them the equivalent filtering and let them experience what other people experience.
Professors Anna Lawson and Rich Romano. And our thanks to BBC producer Sue Mitchell. In the months to come, we're hoping to follow some of Anna Lawson's work, and we're also interested in exploring more widely how we, as blind people, can keep our independence in this fast-changing world, and whether we're missing out by continuing to rely so heavily on dogs and canes to navigate. Call our action line on 0800 044 044 or email intouch@bbc.co.uk. From me, Peter White, producer Lee Kumitat and the team, goodbye.